Welcome to the Patton College of Education's new Munch and Learn series, Global Issues on Immigration. Through these discussions, we seek to increase our understanding of others in order to advocate for and build more inclusive communities. The intersection of immigration and higher education is long-standing. It is important to understand how current immigration challenges and policies are impacting our students and campuses and communities, and determine how best to support them. Why should we prioritize support for undocumented students and international students? According to the Center for Higher Education Leadership, first-generation immigrant students, including undocumented students, second-generation immigrant students, and international students make up close to a third of all students in post-secondary education nationally. Bringing it closer to home, Ohio University's Athens campus and the Patton College have international students enrolled at over 4%. Many first and second generation immigrant and international students look to see whether campuses and institutions are undocu-friendly. In other words, are we welcoming, inclusive, and supportive? How institutions and colleges of education respond to immigrants, international students, and their families matters. Much can be done to be an inclusive university and to demonstrate our support for these students. But as with any students, we need to avoid one-size-fits-all approaches to advising and student support. Instead, we must develop culturally responsive and integrative student-centered care. According to NACADA, a global association for academic advisors in higher education, a culturally responsive student support and advising approach considers social and psychological conditions that affect this particular student demographic. Undocumented immigrant families face constant economic, social, and legal challenges. They increasingly experience the psychological impacts of being a cultural but not a legal citizen, and may feel like they are living in limbo, not fully belonging anywhere. Only a small percentage of undocumented students actually pursue and successfully complete U.S. post-secondary education. And those who do make it to college have overcome great odds and have built above average resiliency. According to NACADA, best practices for building an inclusive culture involve creating a network of support, creating safe spaces to enhance peer and ally support, ensuring confidentiality and campus safety, and providing outreach and resources, including critical legal support and promoting civic engagement. As we begin our discussions on global issues on immigration, know that this series aspires to address these best practices to encourage meaningful dialogue. While we are talking about best practices for higher education, we must particularly employ these practices in colleges of education. We are preparing the next generation of teachers and human service professionals who will also need to provide culturally relevant support and services to immigrant children and families. Recent demographics from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Pew Research Center shows that in 2012, there were 11.4 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, or 3.5% of the nation's population, from which approximately 2.1 million were K-12 aged students. Our nation's past practices and how we treated children and families who are seeking to come to the United States for a better life have not been representative of who we have historically been as Americans. We have a responsibility to turn the page on that sad history. On the day of his inauguration, President Biden did just that. He signed an executive order to preserve the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, otherwise known as DACA, which has shielded hundreds of thousands of people who came to our country as young children from deportation. In the words of Miriam Feldblum, co-founder and executive director of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration, if we're to think broadly about the impacts of immigration across our campuses and act collaboratively, locally, and nationally to support students and other campus stakeholders, we will be in a position to effect positive change in the short and long term. It's the right thing to do, it's the wise thing to do, and it is at the core of our educational missions and communities. Thank you for joining this session on global issues on immigration.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Dwan Robinson, Associate Professor in Educational Leadership and Department Chair in the Department of Educational Studies in the Patton College. I will be your moderator for today's discussion on global issues on immigration, honoring the experiences of immigrant populations in research and scholarship. This is the second of our four-part Munch and Learn series about global issues on immigration, sponsored by Ohio University, the Patton College of Education. As we get started, let me begin by letting you know that today's event is being recorded, and a recording of this session will be live on the Patton College YouTube channel. Also, let me provide a few instructions for your participation. We invite you to place any questions that you may have for the panelists in our chat, and we will get to as many questions as time permits. That said, due to the limited time that we will have together today, we may not get to all of the questions. At the end of the session, however, an evaluation will be placed in the chat, and we do encourage you to take a few moments when the event concludes to provide us with the feedback about your experience. So let's jump right into our discussion. We'll begin with introductions, and it's my pleasure to share who our panelists will be for today. Our panelists include Dr. Bhaskar Upadhyay, Associate Professor in STEM Education from the University of Minnesota. We are also joined by Dr. Emmanuel Jean-Francois, Associate Professor in Educational Studies from the Patton College of Education at Ohio University. In addition, we're joined by Michael Kopish, Associate Professor in Teacher Education from the Patton College of Education at Ohio University. I'd like to take a few moments and allow our panelists to share a little bit about their backgrounds and experiences. We'll start with Dr. Kopish.
Hi, as Dwan mentioned, I'm Dr. Michael Kopish, Associate Professor of Teacher Education at Ohio University. I teach graduate and undergraduate courses in social studies education, global education, and teacher education. The courses that I teach are really the intersection between citizenship and teacher education. I do this through frequent, high-quality, equitable community and civic engagement opportunities to advance the democratic purposes of schooling. Pertaining to our discussion today, some of the scholarship work that I do is in the fields of global citizenship education and the development of globally competent teacher candidates. I've authored or co-authored several peer-reviewed articles on the topic of developing globally competent teacher candidates, and recently was the lead author of an educator's guidebook through the Longview Foundation entitled Preparing Globally Competent Teacher Candidates Through Cross-Cultural Experiential Learning. And I look forward to being with you today.
Thank you, Mike. And Dr. Upadhyay, would you please share a little bit about your experiences with us?
I'm Bhaskar Upadhyay. So the first thing is that I came to this country as an international student, and now I am a citizen of this country. So I am an immigrant, and so learning about and engaging with immigrant issues is very near and dear to me. Most of my work resides in the area of science, social justice, and equity. So within that framework, I explore issues of immigrant students in schools, classrooms, immigrant parents, caretakers, because those issues are really important in the sense that these are families and communities that are part of us now, and we need to help them learn the best we can. Two is that a lot of my work is related to how do we improve STEM education, both for the teachers and the immigrant students and their caretakers. So my work is published in International Journal of Science Education, Journal of Research in Science Teaching, and others. And so the key issue for me is that how do we help promote a balanced, equitable, and socially just STEM education for immigrant students that come to this country in various economic, political, social, cultural situations. And I think I am really looking forward to having a conversation today. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Dr. Jean-Francois, I'd like to hear from you regarding your background, please.
Okay, greetings again, everyone. As you heard, I am Emmanuel Jean-Francois. I'm originally from Haiti, a country in the Caribbean. Therefore, I bring with me my immigrant experiences. I emphasize experiences as an individual. That means I went through the immigration process and live it on a daily basis. Also, I'm a practitioner on issues related to immigration. I was, a couple of years ago, I was the executive director of a nonprofit organization working with immigrant communities, especially the Haitian American immigrants in the Tampa Bay area in Florida. I also work as board members in various nonprofit organizations working with this population, particularly undocumented immigrants. And also, I happen to be an instructor, a faculty for a lot of immigrant students in my classroom. And third, I am a scholar with research experience on issues and topics related to immigrant populations. I have done studies involving CBPR. It's an acronym that stands for Community-Based Participatory Research when I work at the Murphy Cancer Center and Research Institute, probably over 10 years ago now. And I have some CBPR publications that yielded from that as well. And I've been doing comparative research involving various parts of the world: Southeast Asia, Europe, Latin America, Africa. And I'm the author of several books and peer-reviewed research articles. And some of them are relevant for the discussion that we'll be having today on global immigration. And I'm really delighted to share the panel with Dr. Robinson and Dr. Kopish and Dr. Upadhyay. I look forward to having the conversation with you.
Thank you so much. And so we'd like to segue into a question for Bhaskar. Can you briefly share with us what lens or angle you bring to this topic of honoring the experiences of immigrant populations in research and scholarship?
So first of all is that immigrant students, families bring quite a lot of experiences that are very meaningful to them. And also these students are also bringing with them what I call assets for helping them make sense of learning that they are doing, assets for helping them figure out both in terms of socially what's happening in the classroom and the community, as well as what content areas they are learning. So especially in the context of STEM education is that a lot of times STEM contents seem to be divorced from everyday experiences of students, families, communities. And what it is that if we can draw these experiences of students and families into the classroom, it makes learning so much more powerful and meaningful to them. And it's the meaning that the students, when they find in learning, is where we see students really be successful. And one of the things that I always focus on in my research also and in my interactions is that what Norma Gonzalez and Louis Moll call funds of knowledge. So these are knowledge students have that they can utilize in learning, and also teachers can leverage these pieces of knowledge in order to help students engage in it. Therefore, for immigrant students where language, culture, social interactions are so new in the new environment, their funds of knowledge, their experiences gives them a space to see familiar in an unfamiliar space. And that's what I think is really important when we think about immigrant students.
Very nice, thank you. And Mike, if you would briefly share with us what lens or angle you bring to this work and the topic of honoring experiences of immigrant populations in research and scholarship.
Yeah, thanks, Dwan. I bring to this conversation some ways that we can prepare our teacher candidates for the work that they're going to engage in communities and in schools. So I work with a variety of different community partners in local and national and international contexts that support global teacher education. On campus, I partner with the Ohio Program for Intensive English, and with that organization, we have developed the International Cultural Understanding Certificate for the teacher candidates at Patton College. And with that program, we do a series of intercultural competence workshops, getting students to engage with international students on our campus, some of whom are meeting somebody that's an international student for the very first time in their lives. In addition to that, I've partnered with the Somali community in Columbus for some intercultural immersion experiences, along with different organizations in Columbus that help to support the immigrant and refugee communities. I'm also involved in some global curriculum research and exchange programs with universities in Brazil and Turkey, and I'm currently working with a research team on global competence in teacher education with the University of Genoa in Italy. And the connections across these different entities and these different experiences is toward the development of ensuring that our candidates are globally competent and able to interface with the communities and able to interface with the students in our schools.
Thanks very much for that. And Emmanuel, to wrap up this question, would you share with us the lens or angle that you're bringing to this topic?
Thank you very much, Dawn. That is an interesting question in the sense that currently I'm teaching a course on advanced comparative education that involves not only theories in comparative education, intercultural interactions, intercultural communications, but also the methodology for conducting comparative studies and particularly research in another country in a different cultural context. Let's say an immigrant community in Columbus, or an immigrant community in Boston, or a different population in the Appalachian regions. And I have also, actually, I have recently published an article. It's a methodological article that provides insight on the role of culture and context when conducting comparative research. By the way, a research conducted abroad can be what we call a single country study, which is basically a type of comparative research. Basically, my lens come through not only my teaching, but also my scholarly practice through collaborations and partnerships and research with universities in Thailand, in Singapore, France, Germany, Finland, in Latin America, Ecuador, in Africa, the University of South Africa, etc. So I basically trying to do my best to immerse in the practice of comparative research so that the experience that I acquire can be used as teaching tools for my students. A lot of them actually international students. So usually what I advise them is really, if you are involved in research with different communities or in different cultural contexts, it starts with the basics, which is to do your homework, but understanding that your homework is an evolving homework, and it's to check on an ongoing basis your own background and biases, etc. So I'll stop there, and I can elaborate more with other questions.
Thanks very much for that. And so I'd like to offer another question, and this would be for Mike. As we in the Academy guide students in their research endeavors and prepare them to go into the field to become educational professionals, that are some of the key things. What are some of the key things that we want them to be mindful of when engaging with immigrant students and their families?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a really important one, and I upon thinking of it, I've narrowed it down to these three sort of principles. One is to develop some criticality. Two is to develop cultural knowledge with the community. And then the third is to know the policy and resources to hold schools accountable for inclusive and equitable programs and services. And so I'll briefly touch on each one of those. In terms of criticality, I think the challenge in working with teacher candidates in particular, but people more broadly, is that the discourse and rhetoric associated with immigration is xenophobic and dehumanizing. And so reframing the discourse around humans and people and children is very important. Speaking about the journey and the departure and the crossing and the arrival and the attempts at claiming a new home, those stories matter. Talking about transculturation, which is the developmental process that portrays children of immigrants as actors of merging and converging cultures in multi-directional and synchronous ways. And then exploring the macro and micro level factors that influence policy. Students and people that are engaging with immigrant populations have a lot of unlearning to do in order to engage effectively. As I mentioned, developing cultural knowledge with the community. You know, if we just take the state of Ohio, we're 45th in population growth, and the only growth that we are seeing is in the foreign-born population. In Columbus, for example, there are over 100 countries whose home languages are represented in the schools. So gaining cultural knowledge is about redistribution of power and developing authentic relationships and being comfortable with not knowing and being curious about other cultures and attending cultural events and festivals and establishing trusting relationships with community confidence and connectors. And then thinking of community from an assets-based perspective. And then in terms of policy, knowing how immigrant policies affect, or U.S. immigration policies affect children and families in schools, whether it's Plyler versus Doe, or knowing the way that U.S. immigration laws impact U.S. immigration and customs enforcement and officials, how FERPA protects immigrant populations and students, how funding is available. All of those policies have a profound impact on students and families. And so knowing what those policies are helps individuals, teachers, community members, hold schools accountable for inclusive and equitable programs and services.
Thank you for that. And Bhaskar, might you have anything to add?
So I just want to add on to what Mike just presented and Dr. Middleton in the introduction talked about the idea of cultural relevancy. That's really, really essential aspect of supporting, helping, and making sure that immigrant students and families are successful. So one of the things about cultural relevancy is it's not just about food, what people wear, what things people bring from their communities. It's more than that. It's about language. I think one of the big challenges for many teachers and communities when interacting with immigrant population is language, because language is inherently cultural. And there are many words in English. When I talk to my family in Nepal, I have to think, okay, how do I explain this? And then when I talk to my colleagues, friends, neighbors, something from Nepal, here I have to think about, okay, how do I describe this? There's no word for it. What do I do? And this is a challenge in classrooms all the time for teachers, and especially it becomes very challenging in STEM areas. So that's something to really we need to think about, that language is an inherent aspect of culture. Therefore, we have to be very aware of it and consciously make that decision. The other part of it is that we also want to think about that for many immigrant families and students is that their education is interrupted. So we have to figure out how do we bring them back into a regular classroom or out of classroom context where they feel it's comfortable and where they feel that they are accepted. So that's an important aspect of it. It means respect and recognizing differences and valuing it. The key is how do we value cultural differences and how do we use them as a way of providing both opportunity and also for the students an agency to interact. So we have to think about how we think about our content areas, our interaction in terms of how do we increase their sense of social political, cultural awareness. So that way the content doesn't become just the content, but it also then informs the rest of the decisions they make. And then for teachers, it also allows teachers to think about how they can then connect what they are teaching in the way the students have known things about. So it makes sense to them, makes meaning to it. And meaning making is an important component of all learning. And I have said it earlier too, is that that's where we see a lot of changes happen. And we want to think about that as we engage with them, both with the caretakers, adults, as well as with students.
Ah, yes, valuing cultural differences and opportunities for agency. Thank you for that. Emmanuel, again, as we in the Academy guide students in their research endeavors and prepare them to go into the field to become educational professionals, what are some of the key things that we want them to be mindful of when engaging with immigrant students and their families?
Thank you again. I think Mike and Basfar actually touch on some of the key issues here. I see Baskar. But one thing that I will add, actually two. The first one is stereotyping, and because that's usually the first challenge that happens. It's like somebody took a class on diversity or culture, and they learn some broad, statements about people from Nigeria, for example, or people from Brazil. And when they meet, students and parents from that country, they start to treat these people with this assumption that they have, without an understanding that culture is complex. Just because two people are from the same country doesn't mean that they have the same patterns of behavior all the way through, because there are cultural differences inside every country. So stereotype, I think, sometimes is the big issue. Just because you see a student is a Hispanic student, Asian student, or African Black student, it doesn't mean that they don't necessarily speak English. You ask them, do you need an interpreter? Before you ask that, it's important to kind of engage that person and make a determination that that person might need an interpreter, that person may not need it. The other thing that I would say, and I would like us to be very careful about for the rest of the conversation, is to understand that there is not a monolithic group of immigrant people or immigrant students. It varies based on the region, based on the countries where immigrants are from. It varies based on the color of their skin. It varies based on whether an immigrant is a first-generation immigrant or a second-generation immigrant. It varies depending on whether somebody's, a legal resident or an undocumented immigrant. And so each of these groups have unique cultural backgrounds that you have to approach very differently. So understanding that complexity, not using like a cheat sheet to check is very important. Otherwise, there will be a lot of pitfalls. So these are the two things that I would like to add. Yeah.
And so, Emmanuel, while I have you on at this point, what are some of the challenges that immigrant young people face in K-12 schools? And how might educators give voice to these students and highlight them in their research?
Thank you very much. I think it is estimated, the last estimate that I saw, there are about 18 million children in the US, and it may be even more, who are living with immigrant parents in the United States. Some of them are, first, second generation, the categories that I just mentioned. So the issues that they face are diverse. For example, a student from an African country or a Caribbean country, they may face, issues of racism and stereotypes. They may, depending on which country, they may face language issues, linguistic issues like Bhaskar mentioned earlier. Whereas somebody from, let's say, an European country or Norway, I'm just quote unquote, or Australia, etc., they may have a different type of challenge for cultural adaptation, homesickness, etc. Someone or a student who is a new immigrant in the United States has to do like the linguistic adaptation, the cultural adaptation, and then have to deal with the cultural clash inside the classroom. I will give some examples. One example, I've visited a lot of classrooms, whether it's in the area or in Wisconsin or in Florida, etc. When you go to an actual classroom, you see the teacher has a certain set of rules. One of them is do not look at the teacher in the eyes. But in many other countries, African countries, Latin American countries, Caribbean countries, if you look at an adult in the eyes, it is a sign of disrespect. So oftentimes you will find students who, when they are in the house, they receive that instruction that you're not supposed to look at me in the eyes. And then when they go to school, the teacher said that's exactly what you are supposed to do. They do not know what to believe. And there's the issue of tracking. For example, you go to some classrooms, you see all the, the black students, they are sitting in the corner, and then the teachers, and they are supposed to be like the challenging students. So right there is an issue of social reproduction that is involved. That means that these students who are grouped, and all of them, they have the same skin color, they have the same immigration status, even though the teacher may be well-intentioned, but it sends a signal to them. And also immigrant students in many parts of the United States, sometimes they go to school not knowing whether when they go back home, their parents is gonna be their eyes, whether eyes will pick them up, etc. So there is a lot of these issues that educators and educational leaders need to be aware of when dealing with immigrant population. I'm just talking about the K-12 schools. It's a different issue actually for higher education overall.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And Bhaskar, do you want to elaborate on this? Again, what are some of the challenges immigrant young people face in K-12 schools, and how might educators give voice to these students or highlight them in their research?
So Emmanuel covered quite a lot of things related to what might be some of the challenges, and I'll just elaborate in one or two of them. So obviously we have been talking about this idea of cultural relevancy, and two is being able to provide space and the environment so the students have agency to interact in the classroom. So that way their voice is both counted and also valued. So that's an important aspect of it. The other part of it to think about it is that we teachers also have to think about, and also educators too, and we as researchers and educators is to think about that immigrant students and families come from different backgrounds, right? How they came to United States have different ways they came here. And so thinking about all immigrant students or families as same, what it does is that then it makes us put everybody, as Emmanuel said, in these stereotypical boxes. And so all students are like this, or all students from X continent are like that. And what that does is that then it makes the lives of the students and the teachers equally challenging, because then what happens is that we try to see that one size fits all, and it doesn't. And we know that from research, we know that from our own experiences. And so it's really important to think about it in that way. Two is that whenever we think about, especially for teachers, is that teachers always worry that, do I have to learn every single language and cultural variations that my students have in one section that I teach, and I teach 6 sections in a day, so you can multiply that. And so how do I do it? I am a human being. And one of the things to always think about is that, what are some of the tools we can provide teachers that allows them to utilize students' experiences as a way to both provide students power and agency in the classrooms to figure out their own learning, and also helping teachers learn different nuances about cultural variations. And so that's something to keep in mind. And for us as researchers also to keep in mind that we are going into somebody else's space. It's their space and we are outsiders. Therefore, we have to respect what their cultural, social beliefs and values are. And that's an important thing. So, for example, when I was working with Somali parents, one of the questions came about autism. So Minneapolis has the largest Somali population outside of Somalia. And one of the things is that if you look at literature and even in interviews, Somali parents said, oh, that everybody says that this is autism is amongst us, somehow we are like diseased people. And so one of the ways is to be sensitive about these issues is just because we see certain behavior or certain things in one group doesn't mean that they are the owners of it, right? We have to figure out how it can work for that group, so that way it doesn't become some kind of label, but rather a way to engage both the students, community, and also students who are not from that cultural group. Similarly, I'm very sure many of you have read it. It's called, the book is called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. It's a book on Hmong communities. It's a study in California done on mental health. And one of the things about Hmong community is that if a member in the family has epilepsy, that's considered a spirit sitting in you, and therefore you are, it increases your family's respect in the community. And so now, from the medical point of view, we don't consider epilepsy as something that should be valued that way. But that's not the question. The question is, how do we value these ideas, beliefs, practices, and then you leverage them in a way that allows us to help students engage more. And that's what we want in our teachers, is to think about it as a resource to help engage students, give them power and agency to learn more, and then also help community to be part of this educational process. We have to bring the community, otherwise it's just not possible to help immigrant kids succeed in schools.
Very good, thank you. Mike, do you have anything additional to add here?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things really quick, especially related to youth voice. Youth participatory action research, there's a whole host of studies and conferences that have been convened that have really pointed to about 4 different categories of what youth report as challenges. One is language, as the others have mentioned, where there's misunderstanding and at times isolation. Cultural adjustment, life is different, and some have idealistic expectations that are not met upon seeing the realities of schooling and also the community. Sense of belonging and the impact on identity in developmental phases. Discrimination and bullying, as Emmanuel mentioned, where stereotypes and bias are reinforced. And then, as Bhaskar mentioned, this notion of education and the feeling of having to start over and over again for the first time, and that school personnel have a very limited understanding of the immigrant or refugee experience, and then don't support in the way that is culturally responsive. And so, what I would want to, I guess, add to what the other 2 panelists have already said is, we need to think more about the way in which our relationships are with the community and with the populations that we're serving, to make them, instead of being exploitative or transactional, to make them transformational types of relationships where there's mutuality and there's benefit and there's a desire to be synergistic. There's an integration of goals, and there's a desire to work with shared resources toward common goals. That is probably the one area that I think we need to stress again and again. It isn't a one-size-fits-all. It really is integrating with the community that builds on trust and establishes trust.
Thanks for that. Yes, mutuality and transformational, not transactional relationships. I appreciate that. All right, so for Emmanuel, what are some of the research approaches and strategies that have been effective in conducting studies on immigrant populations?
This is probably one of the most challenging questions if you are talking about research. And part of the reason that I'm saying that is because there is a lot of challenges related to conducting research on immigrant populations. And if there are challenges, you need to have a toolbox of strategies that you can address and adapt to overcome such challenges. There has been a lot of issues observing immigrant population that may be considered as deviant populations. I used to organize study abroad in the Czech Republic. That was a good experience for me, doing study with the Roma population. If you watch TV, that there used to be that show that they call the gypsies, and that they consider as nomad, etc. There are issues on how do you ask sensitive questions on surveys or doing face-to-face interviews with immigrant population with different cultural experiences, because certain conversation that we can have in the US during an interview or during a focus group, people with certain cultural beliefs, they are not necessarily comfortable to have this type of conversations. There are issues surrounding, adversarial research, which means that you are doing a study on an immigrant population, but it is so sensitive that it's very difficult for you to get in because people do not want to open the door to the outside world. And the issue of sensitive data, and sometimes it can be study that involve a threatening political environment, like research on undocumented, population. And also there are cases, which is one that I dealt with 2004 when I first moved to Tampa, Florida, where there is a lack of official population data to develop adequate sampling. So I shared some of the issues. I'm sure there are more, but to explain why there is a justification to talk about approaches and strategies. I'm not talking in terms of qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method. These are broad paradigms. I'm talking about specific strategies and approaches that you can use, whether you are doing qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method. But the one that I will start with is positionality. I think I mentioned that earlier. It is the idea of checking your biases as a researcher. Whenever you have your own cultural background, your own education, you are interacting with a different community, you need to understand that you carry bias. And every one of us, we have biases. The difference is how we deal with it. The difference is whether we develop an awareness and we reflect on it and develop a plan to prevent these biases from affecting our interactions with other communities. The second thing I'll talk about is, I will mention is as a preparation is cultural humility, which is the understanding that just because somebody has a different cultural experience doesn't put it in a relation of superior or inferior or a deficit. It's just different. So cultural humility is the understanding that you are ignorant of certain aspect of other culture, and it is important for you to be open-minded, to be humble, and to listen, to ask questions genuinely, and in order to interact in a meaningful way with people. But broadly speaking, in terms of broader, methodologies and approaches, ethnography, which involves participant observation, is usually a good way to interact with immigrant, population in general, which is you don't go and then you go and you ask your questions and you leave. And you may not be able to even ask the question. It is the ability to develop a relationship, to build rapport with the community, and to participate in some of the activities that do not necessarily involve the research, and so that you can develop trust. I've been involved in community-based participatory research, and I have one of the studies that was published by the Journal of the National Medical Association. It was a study on colorectal cancer. It was interesting in the sense that sometimes immigrants community, they can build walls so that people do not penetrate. For a variety of reasons, somebody that you interact with may be legally present in the United States, but that person may have 2 or 3 undocumented immigrants. So by virtue of interacting with you, that can put these people at risk. So therefore, involving these people in the process through community-based participatory research, or if you are doing an intervention, but also there is community-based qualitative research as well, is very important, because the involvement means that they know what your purpose is. They know what your research questions are. They know why you are using this framework instead of that framework. So they are fully involved in the process. So that gives you an opportunity to collect your data and do analysis. But other types of methods, like narrative inquiry, for example, which is the idea of give the participants an opportunity to express their voice in a way that is reflective, that is meaningful to them, and that accounts for their relevant experience, can be a good tool. And the other one that I would say is triangulation. So triangulation is not just about using, using some interview and using some documentation. You can triangulate population, you can triangulate data. One example that I will cite is that immigrant communities in the US, they carry with them issues of social class from their countries. So therefore, triangulation is very of participants is very important at time, because depending on which social class that somebody was in their home country, they will give you one perspective about certain things. And somebody who is from the middle class, for example, will share something one way. Somebody who is from the working class, or somebody from the south part of the northern part, etc. And the other thing that I would say is that when you are dealing with immigrant population, there is that concept of gatekeepers. There are people in an immigrant community. If you do not have the permission of these people, you cannot have access to the participants, because they can be community leaders, they can be religious leaders, they can be opinion leaders. So they really they really hold the key for that community. So there is a lot of other approaches that I could talk about, but I understand the limit of time, so I will stop there to give my other colleagues an opportunity to jump in if they want to add something.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Interesting concepts of cultural humility and gatekeepers. Thank you for those ideas. So the next question has to do with theoretical frameworks for research. What are some of the theoretical frameworks, concepts, and perspectives that you can help us think about with immigrant-focused research? For example, some of you have talked about transformative theories, critical theories, maybe the work of Freire, of Guy. And I'm going to go to Bhaskar first for a response.
Thank you. So the names and the theories that Dr. Johnson mentioned, all those, and including, so because my work is on issues of equity, social justice, race, socio-political consciousness, agency. So I'm always thinking about engaging with students, engaging with teachers, engaging with families and communities of immigrant population through those lenses, because what I find very important to understand, if we are to help teachers, students, parents, caretakers, and communities to be part of an education that is beneficial to them and the larger society, we also be able to ask difficult questions. We have to challenge the status quo. We have to challenge the curriculum. We have to challenge pedagogy. We have to challenge how we assess a student. And these things, we need to think about it more critically using social justice lenses, critical theory lenses, intersectionality. Lately, I'm looking at Marian Barr's work on liberation social psychology. It comes from social psychology, but it's developed by a Jesuit priest in El Salvador, helping mental health issues of communities there because of the civil war, the unrest, all of those things. So the lenses are really, really important, because these theories allow us to then help us understand better. The other part, I just want to add what Emmanuel earlier shared, is whenever we think about engaging with immigrant population or any other cultural group, is that the idea of emic and etic, where do we lie, right? So are we insider or outsiders? And that tension in research always exists. And in the same way, if we think about critical lenses in order to look at issues of social justice, race, these things have to be looked at through the lens of the layered aspects of it, right? It's like layered as onions. So you peel one layer, it's not just that somebody is female. It's not just somebody is African American, or it's not just somebody is Native American, or it's not just somebody is Asian immigrant. It's all of these things intersect, and therefore the idea of the intersectionality is really powerful tool to help us understand the nuances of this. And the other part of it is that I think at the end of the day, the goal of research, theory, teaching, helping families and students, helping teachers, at the end of the day, it's about wellness of the individual. So when I think about STEM education is about wellness. It's not just about learning something. It's about how does that learning helps me become well. And wellness is not just about mental and physical. It's about social, it's about cultural, it's about physical, it's about infrastructure, it's about access to parks, it's about access to beaches or walking space. All of these things are part of it. And the way I think about it is that all of these different theories should allow us to then look at and explore the nuances of what are the challenges and potential opportunities that we can provide and understand in helping us see how we can help them, right? How can we provide these spaces of great interactions where immigrant students, families, communities feel comfortable to engage in?
Thank you, Bhaskar. And the thought of intersectionality and an onion and peeling back the layers of an onion can really help us think about immigrant-focused research and strategies. Dr. Kopish, I'd like to ask if you have anything to add. Again, we're thinking about theoretical frameworks, concepts, and perspectives that can help us consider immigrant-focused research.
Yeah, so what we know from the literature is that there are several different frameworks and theoretical lenses that are used. There's a eco-developmental theory, which is bringing together ecological systems model of Brofenbrenner with developmental theories that look at the family life cycle model. Historical trauma theory, which looks at the traumatic experiences that extend across generations. General systems theory, the human ecology framework, a resilience framework, and then critical theories as well. What we note with all of these is that the role of family plays an important role in the immigrant experience. And so what you see with a lot of the theoretical frameworks that are used in the literature is to expand into the context of the immigrant family as well. In my own work, again, because the nexus for me is the development of citizens and educators, is a global citizenship education framework, which seeks to develop knowledge, skills, and values to secure a more just, peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, and sustainable world. And I do that through some different critical approaches to global citizenship education, including the work of feminist and post-colonial scholars. And again, the goal for me is the development of some nimble citizens that have some of the cultural capacity and cultural capabilities of engaging in the community and engaging with students in a variety of different contexts. I seek to develop critical consciousness with the teacher candidates with whom I work, because all of the things that Emmanuel and Bhaskar have mentioned, the folks that we have going out into these communities are going to have to be culturally nimble in order to navigate the complexity and to be advocates for those that are perhaps the most marginalized or perhaps the most vulnerable, but certainly toward the goal of equity, they're going to need to be advocates for all.
Absolutely. So thank you for that and for sharing those additional insights. I'm going to take a question from the audience at this point. I'd like us to move to some of the questions that our participants in the audience have. And so the first question from the audience is, are the cultural immersion activities from the Columbus immigrant communities mandatory for students? And so Dr. Kopish, I'd start with you on this one.
So in a word, no. There is at the 2000 block level the RUC, or the Rural Urban Collaborative, where students are assigned for field experience hours in Columbus area schools, but it is not specifically in schools that are, or it's not associated with the immigration and immersion experience. That was a project that was funded through the Longview Foundation, and it was one that that I developed with the Somali Community Association, and have engaged my students through that experience, typically through my issues in global ed class. But it is not something that is mandatory for teacher candidates.
Okay, very good, thank you. And might you clarify something that you talked about earlier? You talked about the 2000 block. Would you just elaborate on that a bit? There was a question that related to that.
Yeah, so in teacher candidates program of study, there are a series of courses related to diversity and equity within the 2000 level. So these would be roughly their second year within the teacher education program of study, whether it's elementary, middle, or adolescent, young adult. And so one of the things that is included in that is the Rural Urban Collaborative, or the RUC. And again, that's where students are partnered with schools in the Columbus area for our work candidates to get some field placement experience with schools that are in the Columbus area.
Excellent, thank you very much. Dr. Jean-Francois, might you have any insights on cultural immersion activities involving Columbus immigrant communities? Or might you want to elaborate a little more on the theoretical frameworks that we talked about earlier?
Yes, I would like to kind of stress something on the theoretical frameworks that Mike and Bhaskar talked about earlier, because these are very important issues that I oftentimes see happening, and that are challenges for people doing research with other communities. The first one is to articulate that critical theories involve not only critical race theories, but also involve a lot of the feminist theories, especially within the context of developing countries. And the reason that I wanted to say that is because there are issues that we call transcultural issues, patriarchal and paternalistic societies that were kind of built by colonization still exist in various parts of the world. And immigrants from these countries, just because they come and live in the United States, doesn't mean that paternalistic mindset is not necessarily there. And that requires people who are doing research to look at post-colonial theory very closely to understand that a lot of the frameworks that we use are Western-based, American-based framework that were inspired by the colonial attitude, and that people in developing countries internalize as well. So challenging some of the dominant frameworks is very important, because that help avoid, whether it's in study abroad or study away, like going to Columbus or going to a Native American community, to avoid to look at, to interact with these people with this paternalistic attitude. We think that we want to be nice with them, etc. But in reality, we are behaving like the colons behave to these other people, because we think we know them, we know how to, we have these stereotypes, this attitude. And so the other thing that I would say is, when you are dealing with the immigration community, there is that notion of enculturation and acculturation that we need to think about very carefully. In a nutshell, enculturation means it's an anthropological term. This is what the sociologists call socialization, which is all the things that we learn from when we were born, as we become adults, etc. Acculturation is when you have to unlearn some of these things because you are living in a different society, in a different community. So understanding that there is a change, there is a conflict, an ongoing conflict that is being taking place, and that you need to be patient for people to make this adjustment, and you need to be patient in your interactions for because assimilation, which is kind of a negative term in a certain sense, or integration, does not happen overnight. So I wanted to stress that.
Thank you for following up on that. Another question from the audience. Immigrants are often wary about interacting with people not from their communities. How have you been able to stay engaged with the communities where the immigrants are located?
So,
Bhaskar?
yeah. So, first of all, I think it's human nature to be unsure about. I think it's more about uncertainty from immigrant families and students as to just the sort of norms and rules of a community, right? So they are coming from a different norms and values, how you interact with people in the community, to a new space where there are different rules or norms of interaction. And so it's a normal thing. But one of the important aspects of it is that it's about building relationships, and relationships always take time. One of the challenges for us, we find, is that we live in a society which is efficiency oriented. It's 2 o'clock, we have to do this. It's 2:05, we have to go there, right? And it's not like, okay, it's 2 o'clock, we are still having conversation, let's keep the conversation going. So it's an important thing to understand that in this building relationship is that how do we think about the immigrant family's contribution or their space. So one of the things I always try to do is to ensure that I am always there for them if they needed something, right? About their kids' education, if they needed a different kind of resource. Two is always valuing what they have to offer, right? Is that they have a lot of things that they can offer us, and their concerns, challenges are really important. So one of the things is that how do we value them as individuals, and also their ideas and suggestions and their concerns are equally valuable. And then the other part of it is that every solution is a mutually agreed solution. Every interaction is a mutually agreed interaction, rather than I am the person who's knowledgeable. I'll tell you what it is, right? So people very quickly will say, okay, this is not my space. So providing that mutuality of both success and failures are our collaborative effort. It's not that somebody feels it's their failure, it's our failure too. So I think some of the ways that I have interacted is in that fashion, and also be able to be humble about it, is that we also don't know a lot of things, so we learn about it. And that's an important part of it, is to learn their way of doing things. Therefore, we can incorporate that as we interact. And we have to think about it more in terms of relationship building and trust building, rather than we have to get this thing done by 1 month time, because that would not work out for either side.
Right, the building mutuality you've talked about several times. Thank you for that. So, Mike, immigrants are often wary about interacting with people not from their community. How have you been able to stay engaged with these communities?
Well, it's interesting because as Bhaskar just mentioned, this notion of time is really important, and so a year in advance of establishing the partnership, I began making calls to the community connectors, those that are in the Somali community and are respected within that community, and began to engage with them and to co-plan with them and to build trust, and that took a long time. We had some amazing plans as well for the year 2017 until the previous administration fundamentally changed the way that policy was interpreted, immigration policy in particular. And some of the hardline rhetoric made for the trust that we had established start to deteriorate, especially outside that core group and in the community. And so we had to take a step back and to revisit and to reevaluate what it was that we could do, because we had a number of members of the community that were no longer comfortable with our students being within their community for collaborative activities. What's interesting is that in some cases there was a belief that my students potentially were ICE agents that were going to be collecting information on members of the community, which of course was patently false, but it nevertheless was a real concern in the minds of members of the community. And so we had to take a step back and to reevaluate and to co-plan and to have it look a little bit differently. But at the same time, it was a really important opportunity for us to reprioritize and to think about other ways that we can ensure that collaboration is going to have mutual benefit.
Very good. Thank you for that. And so we have one additional question from the audience. And Dr. Jean-Francois, I'd like to begin with you. How do we make this conversation about cultural humility a critical policy issue in the Department of Education at the state or federal level?
Oh, that is a 10 million or $10 billion question. I think it can. It starts with leadership. I know that in 2010, during the Obama administration, there was a global education on policy, and there are still the remnants of that from the website of the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education. the way you enact that into policy is really to have a leadership decision that is being made, not only from the president of the United States, which is, if you are talking about the federal level, but also through the implementation arm of the president, which is the U.S. Secretary of Education. And if it doesn't come from that leadership, it's not going to happen. This is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is by involving the U.S. Congress, because if you want to have a policy that is sustainable, it has to be coded in laws, in regulations. So, and it's a different territory that requires having the right people with the right intents, that require to have people who are not infected by bigotry, who are making, legislation. So there is a bunch of components involved. And at the state level, it is the same thing. It requires the leadership of the governor. It requires the leadership of the state legislature, the representative. But also there is a third wheel. It requires the involvement, the active involvement of civil society organizations and groups to lobby these people, because you may have good intention, but if there is no mandate behind it, if there is no funding to implement it, it's not going to happen. So this is why I think that you can translate that into a policy through activism and then leadership. If I would like to give a short answer.
Thank you for that answer. Mike, insights for policy, this idea of cultural humility as a critical policy issue.
Yeah, I think the levers that Emmanuel mentioned are what I would argue too, that it has to be a multi-tier approach. I know that coming up with the National Council for Social Studies, for example, I'm working with the International Assembly to adopt some language to advocate for global citizenship education within the National Council for Social Studies. I know that there are some groups that are looking at revisiting civic education as a way to think about how we develop people's skill set and people's acumen for affecting change in our democracy. And so the policymakers matter, but the people who are influencing the policymakers and the stakeholders matter as well. And so as far as influencing policy, any policy is merely a suggestion, and it's up to the people to hold institutions accountable for those policies. And so the power is really with the people.
Absolutely. The coalitions and partnerships with those who are listening to this webinar and who will be listening to this session in the future. Thank you for that. Bhaskar, from your vantage point, do you have any insights on this policy issue related to, cultural humility and this conversation?
I think humility is about not oneself, it's about somebody else. And so if we think about education and policies around it are designed, developed, and implemented by people in power, right? So one of the things to think about as a policymaker is that what does this policy do good for people who are not in positions of power? And how do we think about those people? Because if we want to transform how we interact with so-called others, is that how do we see ourselves and our own abilities in different ways, right? From language to material things to cultural things, is that how do we see other people's contributions, cultures, language, all of those things that will allow us to then infuse it in policy making, which then benefits the group that we intend to, but at the same time, it also benefits the group that is outside of that intended group. So humility as a policy is that, in my opinion, it has the potential to reduce many unintended bad consequences that could creep into policy.
Very good. Thank you for that. And so in closing, I'd like to really thank our panelists for today's events, for sharing your time, your experiences, and your perspectives with us. I also want to thank you, the participants in the audience, for joining us today. The evaluation for today's event is being placed in the chat, and we encourage you to take a few minutes to give us some feedback about your experience with this session. In addition, a recording of this session will be added to the Patton College of Education's YouTube channel by the end of the week. If, in case you would like to rewatch the session or encourage your coworkers and others to view it, we would be most appreciative. The next educational session in the Patton College of Education is a session on global issues on immigration, and it's a part of this series. It'll be held on Monday, March 22nd from noon to 1:30, and the area of focus will be international students and immigration, perspectives from students, faculty, and staff. Thank you so much for joining us. We wish you well. Good day.